Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to ERPIC Live. My co-host again is Dr. Hrayr Jebejian, Director of ERPIC's Law and Democracy Program. And we have with us Dr. Hrayr Jebejian, Secretary General of the Bible Society of the Arab Gulf. Our focus this evening will be on the challenges facing Christian communities in the greater Middle East. As always, our speakers express their own personal views. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Jebejian, I'm sure you've studied the historical developments over the years of the Christian communities. What in this part of the world, what is the fate of Christianity in the Middle East?
First of all, thank you very much for being here for this panel discussion. It's so exciting to see that we have the opportunity in order to discuss and do some brainstorming about some of the critical issues that especially the Middle East is going through, which of course it has its impact and its influence on the rest of the world. The Christian communities and the fate of the Christians is one of the contemporary issues that we are dealing with these days, and the whole world is talking about, especially as to what's happening recently in Iraq and in Syria. Before answering to your question, may I pause for a minute and say one important thing. Christianity and the Christian church was born in Middle East. And this is something which we really need to deal with. The Christian community is not a guest in a way. The Christian community was born in Middle East. Christ was born in Bethlehem, and Bethlehem is Middle East. So Christianity, right from its birth, was part of the land, of this land, which is the Middle East. It was a part of the culture. It went through all the developments in the Middle East. It contributed a lot to the welfare of the communities in the Middle East. It shared the struggles, its pains, and its joys. So when we talk about the Christian presence in the Middle East, we have to say that the Christians are part of the community in which they are living today. So when we talk about all these problems and the issues and the persecutions of the Christians, so we need to bear in mind that the Christians are not guests, but they are locals who are living in this part of the world. And of course, we are all following, unfortunately, all the tragic events that's happening with the Christian community. But let me draw to your kind attention to one important fact, which I personally believe that we have to deal with these issues. It is true that the Christians are being persecuted. It is true that the Christians are being expelled from their own homelands in which they were born and they were raised, with all the churches and with all the schools, with all the communities in which they are living in. But I would dare to say that the Christians are not the only minority or the only community which are being persecuted or which are being expelled from their own community. Unfortunately, the situation throughout the Middle East, the greater Middle East, is very complicated these days. It's very confusing, and least to say, it's very messy. We are witnessing a so-called a new ideology coming up in our region, so-called a new culture, if you want to put it, which is the rejection of the other. To put it simply, if you're not with us, then you're against us. And this whole ideology, unfortunately, is formed what we call the fundamentalist, the religious
how
fundamentalist.
new is this, though? Can I call you Hrayr?
Yes, of course.
You say that Christians are not guests, but whether you're a guest or a trespasser depends on the one who holds the title deed of the property. And now the title deed of these countries is held by non-Christians. And therefore, it is their view, it seems, that counts.
Yes.
So it's one thing saying that Christianity belongs here, as far as Christianity and the Christians are concerned. But that doesn't speak of the other side, the side that dictates whether they can live here or not.
Yeah.
Because I take it this is what you're alluding to with this change of philosophy.
Yeah.
It is a decision to dictate to others whether they can live here or not, and with the ability to carry it through.
Yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, Christians were always a minority in the Greater Middle East. They were always minority. They were never majority. So they were always minority.
Even in the time of the Byzantine Empire? Or
well, I mean, I'm talking about the
modern era.
Modern era.
Sure,
I mean, if you look into the modern era, they were always a minority, and the majority were Islam. But what we are really witnessing these days is the so-called growing fundamentalism, the religious fundamentalism, which is creating sort of a new ideology, a new culture, which is the culture of
Is it
rejecting the other.
fundamentalism or radicalization? Because there's all these terms are being thrown around. Is it radicalized Islam? Is it fundamental Islam?
It's a fundamental Islam.
Is it just Islam rediscovered? You know?
Not exactly, because if you look into what's happening in the Middle East these days, it's not only Christians who are being persecuted. And this is what I was trying to emphasize right from the beginning.
So is it radicalized Islam? And
Yes.
if so, why did it all of a sudden become radicalized?
Well, I mean,
Is it a result of the Gulf War, of what? There's some, was it something that was growing gradually? You've been here longer and been witnessing these things,
yeah, I mean, it's
firsthand.
It's very interesting the way that the communities and their ideologies are being developed. And recently I was really reviewing one of the sociologists, Robertson, who is an expert in globalization. In today's globalized world, he says, people are losing their identity, and they are being threatened. And against that, people are in search for their personal story,
Yeah.
because they are losing the bigger story. And this personal story is creating some kind of a paradox, which what we have today, and we are coming with some form of a political identity, which is what we call the radicalism.
But a lot of people have made that point, that in fact what's happening in its radicalization, but also tribalization.
Yeah.
It's the region is breaking up into tribalism, but with an overarching radical Islam.
Yes, but not all Islam are radical. That's also one of the things that because
Granted.
if you look into the overall situation as to what's happening in the Greater Middle East, we have, yes, on the one side Christians are suffering, but there are also other minorities who are equally suffering.
But that doesn't make it right.
Of course it doesn't make right. Of course it doesn't make right. But what I'm trying to say is that, yes, Christians are suffering, but also other ethnic groups and minorities are also suffering. And among them are also Muslim minorities, like the Shias, for example, who are being suffered. And there are also the Yazidis, for example, who are being persecuted, and they were expelled from their own. And the Kurds, for example, who are also being suffered. So what we are witnessing these days is a kind of an ethnic conflicts in this region, where the Christians are also part of this land and in this ethnic nation, because they are not part of the so-called other. They are part of the other, and they are not belong to that particular group or that ideology, so they have been also persecuted. So in this respect, it is not right to say that it's only the Christians who are being targeted.
Right, granted. But come back to that point that I tried to the question I posed. Was this gradual in coming, or was it a reaction to something? Or is there a controlling mind behind it? Is it a conscious development? Is it a natural development of history?
It's not natural history, because as you look into all the events that's happening in the world, and especially in the Middle East, you could see how gradually it developed. It started with Al-Qaeda, and then eventually it moved into what we are calling these days into ISIS, which is a sort of an ideology. And a religious ideology, religious fundamentalism, which is being taught to especially to this young generation who have been recruited.
Again, it's a natural development, or a planned
It all depends what you
action.
mean by saying planned action. I mean,
Well,
it's, for
a
every action there's an
conscious-
opposite reaction, as they say it in the physics.
Sure, but there are certain things which begin in somebody's mind or collectively,
Yes.
and it is implemented in politics and geopolitics. It's often the case. Somebody wakes up with a great idea and tries to implement it. And on the other hand, there are certain dynamics of history, natural forces, which create certain developments and certain events.
Yeah.
Is this the first or the second? Or a combination of the two, perhaps, but more the first or the second?
I'm not a politician, but if you follow the trends that happened over the last, let's say, 10 or 15 years, you could see
I'm not looking for conspiracy here.
No, I understand that.
But it seems that there's an organizational element behind what is happening.
Definitely.
A systematic movement, a systematic action.
They are calling themselves ISIS, for example, fundamentalist or extreme, what we are calling it. It's a kind of, it's definitely an organization which is running this whole fundamentalist movement, the rejection of the other, and all the so-called, and the establishment of the Islamic Caliphate, which they are aiming for.
And the reason for the question is, if it's A, and you deal with this organizing mind in one way or the other, you can perhaps solve the problem. But if it's a deeper, systemic, structural, historical trend, it's more difficult to deal with.
Of course, and this is what's happening now. I mean, it's becoming more and more difficult to deal with, because it's no more staying in the Middle East area, and it is spreading, unfortunately. And this is where, I mean, internationally, it is
becoming a force of nature, a force of history.
It looks as if
a force of history.
It looks as if, look at what happened in France, for example, in Paris, with all the terrorist attacks, which they claimed that they were responsible for it, and also in other places where there is a kind of an atmosphere of fear and an atmosphere of tensions all around the world when you move around. So it started in the Middle East. It's really an important hub for them in the Middle East, but it is also spreading, and it's becoming an international threat. So how to deal with that, and where are we aiming for? Where are we going for?
What's the fate of democracy?
I have a question for you, Hrayr. Can we view the present day cruelty and discrimination and killing in historical context? And if so, how far back can we look to identify the source of this cruelty?
There is this famous saying which says history always repeats itself, right? So it's only that the perpetrators are different. So I mean, definitely it's all interrelated, but the culture changes, the way that we do things changes, whether that's good or whether, and that's the crime is also, it's similar to what you are referring. It starts, and if you look back into the history of let's go back to the early history, the first 20th century history, you can see, I mean, that how genocides took place in the beginning of the 20th century, starting with the Armenian genocide, then the Jewish Holocaust, and today with the Christian persecutions, and with the Yazidis, or the genocide, which they are even actually calling it as a genocide. So you could see how the historical events are really taking place. As I said, history is repeating itself, but it's only the culture is way. Maybe in those days, in the earlier days, there wasn't the so-called ideology of the religious fundamentalism. Today we have a new kind of an entity, an ideology, which is called religious fundamentalism, or whatever you want to name it, which is doing the murder. But the murder is there, it's going on.
Can I just, as a follow-up to that,
sure.
It's dangerous to ask the question, what if, but I'll ask it nonetheless. What if the Western powers had clamped down on Turkey when it engaged in the unlawful killing and genocide of the Armenians during the First World War? And what if the genocide and unlawful killing of the Armenians was followed by a proper war crimes process?
Yes.
Would Hitler and the Nazi regime have embarked upon the Holocaust, or would they have thought twice?
It's one.
And would today ISIS, or whatever it's called, think twice about committing genocide in the Middle East
That's,
today?
that's a very good question, because this argument was raised in last April in Yerevan, in Armenia, during this international conference on the Armenian genocide, which was organized by the government of Armenia, where all the speakers, where all the lecturers were foreigners. There wasn't any single Armenian lecturer who made the presentation. And one of the lecturers, he was from Scotland, Professor Donald Bloxham, he was the one who raised this issue, that because the Armenian genocide being the first genocide of the 20th century, because it remained unpunished, unpunished, it gave way to other genocides to take place throughout the history. So, in a way, he tried to make a connection between the crimes, irrespective of where the crime took place.
You see, if we look at the, I always call it the unlawful killing and genocide of the Armenians, because the genocide began with the death of a single person.
Yes.
And each individual death collectively constituted the genocide. So we must never forget that the collective destruction of the Armenians is the consequence of the destruction of individual lives.
Exactly.
That's why it's important to remember that.
Exactly.
But I think this is an interesting discussion, because if we look at the genocide and unlawful killing of the Armenians, they were assisted directly or indirectly by the Germans during the First World War. And then at the end of the First World War, the Allied powers did not launch a Nuremberg-style war crimes process. Yes. So what history teaches us often is that the perpetrator of murder, manslaughter and genocide is sometimes, but not always, assisted by external actors. And this, I suppose, brings us to the question of Christodoulos. What we're seeing today, individual killings taking place on the ground, they form part of what is arguably a genocide. And then this brings us to the key question: are there external actors that are manipulating the situation or assisting in any way?
Well, when it comes to the Armenian genocide, for example, I mean, of course, you have the historical verifications for that. Of course, the perpetrators was the Ottoman Turkey in those days, but Ottoman Turkey was an ally with the Germans and with the other nations. But of course, you have all these foreign diplomatic agencies or officers who were there who were witnessing what was happening with the Armenian nations. There were all these missionaries, there were all these diplomats who were there.
But it's thanks to one of them, Morgenthau, that one knows what happened.
Yes, of course.
If it wasn't for that, it would have been a dark space in history.
Exactly.
But this is interesting. I mean, most countries in the Middle East claim to be democracies. In some ways liberal, well, not liberal, illiberal, but yet nevertheless they try to claim the sticker or the banner of a democratic regime. Now, they have constitutions. Constitutions indicate what actions are to be taken with human rights, etc., minorities, and so on. Again, historically, I'll pose a question to you. Was the fate of the Christian communities better? Did they fare better under the Ba'athist regimes, for example, the secular Ba'athist regimes? Is it the more religious the regimes become, that they become less tolerant? Is there something to say in favor of, the secular regimes that became the anathema of the Arab Springs? Mm-hmm. Are we looking at it the other way around?
If you are going to look from a purely, let's say, the Christian context.
No, the minorities.
The minorities. I mean, during these regimes, one should admit that the minorities were protected. For example, in Iraq, the Christians under Saddam were well treated and respected and protected.
For his own political reasons,
Yeah,
presumably.
obviously,
not a matter of ideology.
Obviously,
Or
everybody
was
has
it? Or was it a matter of ideology?
Well,
Was it a Ba'athist ideology?
It was the Ba'athist ideology with Saddam, and then the Christian community was a minority. They were protected, and they were doing well. I mean, during the Saddam's times, and Christian community had its own freedom during these days in terms of worship, in terms of printing the Bible, in terms of this, in terms of that.
They printed the Bible in Baghdad?
Exactly. I mean, let me give you an example.
Oh, you did?
We did, yes, we did, yes. For example, I mean, it sounds a bit surprising, but during Saddam's times, we printed the Bible, Arabic Bible, in Baghdad. In Baghdad. And we were free, as a Bible society, as an organization, to distribute the Bible within the schools. Even, to your own surprise, we received also requests from local government sources to distribute the Bible within the government department.
Today it's changed?
Today it's changed. In Baghdad, let's say, I mean, it's still, I mean, because in the Baghdad, the regime is different than in the other places where under the ISIS occupation or whatever you want to call them. But at least today Baghdad is protected. But in Saddam's time, they were protected and they were respected. You know, we have to admit that.
What about Syria?
Objective. In Syria, again, the same thing. The Christian communities were protected, and also the other minorities were protected and were respected. And I have to say they had quite a good degree of freedom in terms of worship and in terms of their activities. And of course today, when Syria is divided between the part which has been occupied by the fundamentalists and the other part which is the so-called under the government regime, the Christian, needless to say, is all under the government control area. So they still enjoy this protection. They still enjoy the respect of the local authorities. So throughout the history in Syria,
but not the Christian or the
Yazidis.
Yazidis, yes. I mean, they are all, I mean, part on the border with Iraq, you know, between Syria and Iraq. So
right.
they are all concentrated in those areas where there was quite a lot of, you know, deportation of the Yazidis and the persecutions, and so by the fundamentalists.
They're Muslim, or they're sort of, but in a particular type of
Islam. Yeah, the Yazidis, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they are a minority which is not necessarily of following the Islamic theology.
Christodoulos made an interesting point that I want to pick on here. It's a generalization, but it's worth making. It appears to be that the more religious the regime, the more vulnerable the Christians happen to be. And it takes us back to the Armenians. We should never forget that the unlawful killing and genocide of the Armenians took place at a time when Turkey was a caliphate as well as an empire. The genocide and unlawful killing took place at a time when Turkey had issued a jihad against the non-Muslim enemies of Turkey, and that it was a religious regime. And so I think we've got to be very careful about reintroducing.
It all depends. It all depends how you want to define the religious regime.
Well, yeah, I tell you how. In a basic way. I think you must admit that what's coming together in this part of the world today is a feeling of entitlement to persecute, and a feeling of empowerment to do so.
Yes.
So there's two, an inclination to do it,
yeah,
and the ability to do it. Okay, and I think those two things, and this is what I was sort of probably thinking about of a fishing expedition before. That is it a trend of history, or is it a trend of, or is it the effect of a policy by somebody? You know, I think the empowerment element, or maybe there's a combination of both. There's a combination in both of these dynamics that are converging, because, you know, I think all of a sudden, you can't get it out of my mind that Muslims in this part of the world feel entitled to assert their prominence or their in some way. Is it a reaction to the new crusades, what they call them, etc.? There's something there.
Yeah,
but there's also the empowerment element. There is some governments are making it possible for these people to do this.
Well,
you know,
okay.
I'm not insinuating that it's the West or this or that. So, there has to be some sort of organized support for these things.
I don't want to enter into the political analysis because I'm not a politician, but coming back to what he was referring to, the religious governments. For example, most of the Arab countries are non-Christian countries, so-called. With the exception of Lebanon, where we have sort of a Christian image in the sense that the president is a Christian Maronite. And that's because the Lebanese setup is based on religious denominations. We have around 19 officially recognized religious denominations. And all the government posts are divided according to your religious denomination, where the president should be a Christian Maronite. In that sense, we have some kind of a Christian image in Lebanon. But the rest, before all this Arab Spring and so on and so forth, they are all Muslim countries, the Arab countries. And we had, and we still have, Christian communities who are living in these countries. And they were living in coexistence with the Muslims.
What are some of the numbers? I think,
okay, for example, in Egypt, if you look into the numbers, 10%, of course it's decreasing, and then we can go into the numbers of it. For example, in Egypt, around the Coptic religious, Coptic Christian community, which is the biggest one, is around, according to some statistics, 10% of the total population, which makes around 8 to 10 million Christian Coptics that are living today. In Syria, there used to be 1.1 million Christians living. In Iraq, 1.5 million. In Palestine, something like between 25,000 to 30,000. In Lebanon, unfortunately, we do not have any recent statistics from quite a long time. But before the war, the Christian... I think the last official recent statistics was done during the French time. I don't know when was that. Unfortunately, we do not have it.
Is that intentional? Because in Cyprus there's no statistics, or at least there are less statistics, not of the Christians, but certainly of the non-Christians.
Yeah, it's...
Was it a policy of not doing this, or what?
There can be a number of things, this and that, okay?
You don't want to answer political questions.
That's not the issue, no. Well, actually, before the 1975, it was around 35 to 40% were Christians. Now that statistics has changed, and especially after the 1975, where so many Lebanese immigrated, and including the Christians. So my guess is that it is less than 35 to 40%. So as you look into this, is some kind of the Christian community. But coming back to your question, I mean, we had a considerable number of Christians who are living under the so-called religious government, if you want to call them religious, and they were enjoying quite good, what you call, religious freedom. For example, if you take into consideration the Arabian Gulf countries, now, definitely, the Christians, there are expatriate Christians who are coming from different parts of the world, from Asia, from Africa, and so on and so forth. But the government has given a plot of land to the Christian community so that they can build their churches. And we have tolerance in this area.
They're not citizens. These are non-citizens. These are second class at best.
Whatever you want to call it, but they are Christians who are living in these countries. And they are enjoying relative freedom. They have their own churches. They have their own setups. They are free to worship within the church compound. So what I'm trying to say is, even though the governments are non-Christian governments or Muslim governments, but we have Christian community who are living. Now, what happened with this new ideology coming up in certain areas?
Particularly the Eastern Mediterranean.
Particularly in Eastern Mediterranean.
At least other way.
Okay, particularly in Eastern Mediterranean. And this religious fundamentalism came. where they started rejecting the other, those who are not of the same mindset like they are. Okay, and the other includes also the Christians.
Yes.
Right. But is there been a change? It would be interesting if there was a change, a radicalization in the Arab Gulf. But you're saying there isn't. There hasn't been.
There hasn't been. There hasn't been in the sense
So
that
there must be a difference between the Muslims of the Gulf versus Muslims of the Eastern Med.
when not all the Muslims in the Eastern Med are
Yes.
fundamentalists.
Yes,
That's
we
also
have to
one of the.
Yes,
No,
we
I
have to
understand, but
I mean,
certainly you're suggesting that there are very few, if any, are in the Gulf, because other than, of course, Saudi Arabia and whatever, but
Yeah.
the other Gulf states are very tolerant. Tolerance is what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Okay, so that hasn't, despite the rise of radicalization in other parts,
It hasn't affected.
it has not
Yes,
affected that.
It has not affected
Now,
that.
I'm postulating, is it perhaps because the Christians in that part of the world are not politically relevant?
You can say
Because
so.
they're not in the political system.
Of course they are not, because they are not citizens of that countries. Now, irrespective of how many years you stay in these countries, if you are a foreigner, you will always remain a foreigner. You will never get a citizenship in these countries. If you are, for example, a Filipino living for 20 years in the Gulf,
Yeah.
with a work visa,
It's not
you
a
never
challenge
become.
to power, whereas...
Can I want to step in here because this is interesting. So what we're learning here is that in the Gulf, settlers or permanent or temporary workers from overseas cannot acquire citizenship.
Yes.
In other words, one day they'll be gone.
Yes.
Whereas in Europe, temporary workers or
Yes.
other migrants or refugees can eventually acquire
Yes.
citizenship. So we're seeing a demographic changes in Europe which are producing
Of course.
new citizens within the law.
Of course.
But the similar process is not being played out in the Gulf.
Yes.
And the important part is that in Europe there is beginning of a competition for power, because MPs in England, in other words, they are taking into consideration the voting power of the new immigrants.
Yeah.
Nothing like that is
Of course,
happening,
not happening. No.
in the Gulf.
And actually, it's not only in the Gulf. For example, if you are in Lebanon, let's say, or in other parts of the Arab world, and if you're living in this country as a foreigner, no matter what kind of a residency status you have, you eventually cannot become a citizen. It was only in Lebanon with a special governmental decree several years ago, which they give citizenship to all these Syrians who were born in Lebanon and were raised in Lebanon, and they lived all their life in Lebanon, and they didn't receive any citizenship. They were still with the Syrian citizenship. That was a special decree. Other than that, you just, as a foreigner, you go to Lebanon, live there for, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, you will not become a citizen of the country.
So the demographics of the citizenry of Europe
Yeah,
are changing, but they're not changing in the,
Is
in the
this
Gulf.
not changing in the Gulf, or even in the Arab world?
Yeah.
Now, of course, you will argue about human rights here and all sorts of these other issues, but that's how the setup is. That's how you either take it or leave it. Maybe I don't know how you want to do it. But that's how it is.
Can I just turn the discussion back to the fate of the victims of persecution, murder, and other forms of improper conduct in the Eastern Mediterranean? I want to just zoom in here on the mechanism of destruction. So when we talk about the persecution of the Christians or the Yazidis or the Shia, whoever else it is that we're talking about in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East, is there a particular process that is followed when a particular group is persecuted or discriminated against or otherwise treated improperly?
I mean, what was happening is, I mean, when you look into all the development that happened in Iraq and in Syria, when they were conquering a place, or that particular city or that particular region was under the threat to be conquered, either that the people left.
You're talking about ISIS now.
Yeah, of course. That's they are the ones who are
Yes.
actually involved in,
Yes.
in the persecution and everything, you know.
So just go through it again. So the first step is,
I mean, whenever
yeah,
if you look into the developments in our part of the world about this issue that you were bringing up. Whenever a city was under the threat to be conquered by the ISIS and so on, what happened? It's either that the people who were living there, because they were concerned about their life, they left or they went. Or once they conquered, there were three things that they told the inhabitants to do. Either you had to be converted to Islam, or if you are not a Muslim, then you have to pay the Giza, which was the tax which was imposed by the Islamic Caliphate throughout the history on the non-Muslims, especially on the Christians and on the Jews. You remember from the, I mean, you are aware from the history how they imposed tax. So they wanted to bring back, actually they are bringing back that which was the Islamic Caliphate and imposing taxation. Or the third one, leave everything, whatever you have in your possession, without taking anything, and leave the country and leave the city. Which means your home, your possession, your wealth, your car, and everything. This
is what happened to the Armenians.
And
this is what happened to the Greeks in Asia Minor. It's what happened to
the
inhabitants of occupied
right?
northern Cyprus.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's good, the correlation that you are making. So this is what exactly happened. I mean, people, the Christians and the other minorities, you know, whoever they were, they left all their possessions from these places in Iraq and in Syria, and they migrated to places which are safer.
So this is not only an attack on human beings on the basis of their race or their religion, this is actually an assault on the right to property.
Of course, of course. I mean, people left their property, I mean, their wealth. They were not able, some people weren't able to take their money from the banks that they had.
So what happens to the title deeds of the Christians or the Yazidis or the Shia or Sunni, whoever it is, who flees from these incoming
people? They just mark that this has been occupied. It is the house of a Christian, a non-Muslim, you know, and it's gone.
And where are these? Let's just stick. The subject matter is about the Christians, so let's zoom in on the Christians.
Yes.
We've heard a lot about the refugees and migrants who are leaving Turkey across the Aegean Sea. We've heard a lot about the people who are fleeing Libya into Italy and other parts of southern Europe. Where are the Christians going to?
Okay, now if you look into the Syrian situation, the situation in Syria, we have more than 1.5 million refugees in Lebanon. And I'm sure you will, it's not that difficult for us to see that a small country like Lebanon cannot absorb this much of refugees in a small country like Lebanon. We have around something like 600 or 700,000 refugees in Jordan. And of course in Turkey there are more than 2 million.
What are the percentages of Christians?
Now, according to some of the unofficial statistics, from 1.1 million Christians, 700,000 have left the country. So that's a really big number, right?
And gone where?
Now, some of them have gone to Lebanon. As you are aware, it's 1.5 million Christians, so a good number of them are in Lebanon. Some who managed to go to Jordan, because there are quite a considerable number of refugees. Those of the Christians who do have relatives in Europe, in Sweden and all these places, because in Sweden also we have a big number of Arabic-speaking communities, I mean, also there. So they have migrated. Or those who are fortunate to travel all the way to Canada or to, other places, they have done so. Some also have managed to also run away to Turkey. And similarly is the Iraqi situation. I mean, you have, according to the statistics, we have something like 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. And according to some of the recent statistics, hardly any, something like 250 or 300,000 have remained. So,
so the Jordanian constitution or regime or whatever is more sympathetic to minorities? Is more tolerant?
I mean, in Jordan, presently, yeah. I mean, Jordan, both the local Christian presence, and also taking on board also all those refugees. In Jordan, the Christian presence is equally respected and tolerated. So, I mean, Christian community, with all our context that we have within the Christian community in Jordan, it's very much respected and tolerated.
Again, refugees, last question, refugees are eventually able to attain the Jordanian citizenship, or no, it's the same thing?
No, it's the same thing
as the Gulf again.
No. None of these refugees will eventually have a citizenship. None of them. For example, Lebanon does also accommodate...
no political rights, obviously.
I mean, does accommodate a big number of Palestinian refugees. In Beirut, we have camps for the Palestinians. And these Palestinian refugees, they do not have any Lebanese passport or citizenship.
And this is for many, many decades.
This is from the 1948.
Right.
Now, all they have is some kind of a, we call it laissez-passer, which is something that the government, Lebanese government issues, which gives the status of a refugee.
And I remember having discussions past. One of the reasons was that they didn't want to diffuse the Palestinian issue, the Arab countries. So they wanted Palestinians to be in limbo so that they would be a pressure against Israel.
Yeah.
So the Palestinians are a little bit different because
of course,
they're not a minority, you know, they're Muslim, they're Sunni, they're etc. I think there was another hidden agenda.
That's another story. Yeah, that's another story.
But
yeah, that's another story. We shouldn't mingle the two. Coming back to your initial question is that, I mean, these people, these refugees, the present refugees, they will never be in a position to get. Whereas in Europe, one day, they most likely, they will be able to get citizenship.
Earlier rather than later.
That's a theme that's emerged from this discussion, which I'll take with me, that there's a difference in approach between the secular liberal democracies of the West and the non-secular, non-liberal democracies, non-liberal and non-democracies of most of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. I wanted to just come back to this theme about the mechanism of destruction, if I may. We've spoken now about the uprooting of human beings from their home. It doesn't matter whether they're Christian or Muslim or Yazidi or Buddhist or whatever their religion is. These are human beings. They've not been treated with dignity. They've not been treated with any form of respect. They've either been coerced out of their homes or they've fled from their homes in fear of their lives. We mentioned the takeover of their properties. What about their churches and other places of religious worship? What has happened to those buildings that have been left behind?
We are witnessing, unfortunately, and this is very sad, we are witnessing destruction of so many churches.
But not only cultural heritage
sites,
ancient Roman ruins.
I mean, this is where my argument will come.
Yeah.
The rejection of the other. This is the reason why I said right from the very beginning, we have a new ideology coming up, which is the rejection of the other. It's not the rejection of the Christian only. It's the rejection of the other. I mean, the destruction of all the ancient history, Syria, Iraq, these are countries which have
steeped in history,
deep historical and cultural heritage. I'm not sure if you have been to these countries where you can see all these historical sites. I mean, some areas in Syria, which unfortunately fell in the hands of the fundamentalists, they destroyed the historical and the cultural sites.
Why?
It's because they just don't want to have anything to do with history, according to their...
We've seen it here in the occupied part of Cyprus. The churches have been destroyed or left abandoned.
Yep.
Icons have been ripped out of churches and sold on the black market.
It's a wish to uproot the culture that is not considered their own culture.
Exactly.
Whereas, and that's the folly about it, because it is their culture at the end of the day.
Our culture.
No, but I'm saying
it's this humanity's culture.
Exactly. Yeah, but I'm saying it was their culture too. Just they're too fanatical to see it. Yeah. But it's. Can I just come back to that point about that in Europe the refugees are entering the power struggle, whereas in this part of the world, minorities and refugees are completely out of the power struggle, yet they're considered a threat to the degree that they have to be exterminated.
In some parts of the
In
world.
some parts.
In some parts.
In some parts.
That should be very clearly
Isn't
defined.
it a little bit sort of, whereas they don't pose any political threat because they're not citizens, they're not, and this is coming back to your point, that, you know, it's the intolerance of the other, but for the sake of what? There is no practical significance. You know, they're not threatening to take over the power of the government. They're not threatening to change the religion. They're not, you know, all they want to do is live. And they're denied that right.
Yep.
You know, so it's a deeper problem, I think.
But allow me to say that the present situation that we have in the Greater Middle East is the concern of everybody. Each and every country in the Greater Middle East, including Europe and the rest of the world, is the concern of all. It's not only the concern of the Christians. The Christians are suffering, that's for sure. But it's the concern of everybody.
Is it? Because what are the British and the Americans and the French and the
doing.
others doing to protect these people from
and some countries of the
subjugation?
region too, because some countries pay lip service and pretend to do something about it. And I will not point any fingers anywhere, but you know it's clear. And yet nothing is.
Nothing is happening.
In fact, they're doing the opposite. They're supporting. You know, the indirect genocide. Again, you don't have to comment, but it's almost a, I mean, it's more than a tragedy. It's a disaster of global proportions.
Christodoulou, what really matters at the end of the day, irrespective of what the political calculations are, human souls are being suffered.
Yeah, but this is
and
my
this
point.
This is the sad part.
Yeah.
You've made a very important point. You said human souls are suffering.
Yeah.
I want to just really press you on this. Quite rightly, we've been focusing on the uprooting of people from their homes, the destruction of churches and other cultural artifacts. But then people are being chucked into refugee camps in Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey or wherever it is. And that must surely have an adverse effect on their soul. So I would suggest that even though many of these Christians or others who've survived the assault upon their homes and their villages and their towns, even though they may have survived, there must be some sort of deep-rooted psychological effect.
Very good point. Very good point. One of the major concerns that we have, rather let's call it a challenge, is these small children, young boys and girls, who are now growing in the refugee tents somewhere in the region. What kind of a new generation are we expecting from this? From these young ones?
Well, this applies, of course, to the Muslim refugees.
Exactly. I'm not talking about.
This cuts across the religions.
I'm not talking about the Christians. I'm talking about the refugees in general.
Especially the children. You're right.
Especially the children. We have a big generation of young ones, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 10 years, 12 years of age. What kind of a generation are we expecting from this? Definitely, a fundamentalist. Definitely. A generation which will grow with a hatred and the pain in their own hearts.
But who would they blame? Would they blame
ISIS? They will blame everybody.
The Americans?
They will blame everybody. They will be some kind of. We will have a new generation, which maybe will eventually grow up to become a fundamentalist. Because
it's not the first
pain in their
It's not the first generation though, because it's already been 30 years since. You know, or whatever years it's been since this generation has been being developed through the Palestinian period and the Iraqi war period and so on. So it's a second generation at least.
I'm not an expert on the Palestinian question, but correct me if I'm wrong. But it took the Palestinians 20 or 30 years to become radicalized after the first Middle East war at the end of the 1940s. And this point about the childhood, it's I do fear for the children who are being brought up with the psychological scars of whatever it is that they've seen in Iraq and in Syria. Is religion the answer? And if so, how?
You want me to answer this from the Christian perspective?
You can answer it from whichever perspective
Well,
you wish.
let's try to end on a positive note.
Yeah.
You know, where do we go from here? Can we go up, or do we have to go down?
I think you want to say something about Christianity.
Yeah,
so feel
okay.
free.
Now, let me share first of all statistics from The Economist, the well-known publication about the present Christian numbers. I mean, in the region. In the 20th century, according to these statistics, the number of Christians in the Greater Middle East compared to the rest was 20%. Now, in the 21st century, it is less than 5%. Now you can see the decrease in the number of Christians. So this obviously will tell us, or will highlight, that we're not very much in a positive trend if this situation continues. But is this good or bad? Definitely it is bad. It is not bad only for the Christian presence, but it is also equally bad for the community in this part of the world.
You were saying to me something earlier about how Christian values and Christian ethics have an effect on the region. So
this
can you just develop that point?
This is what I'm trying to call.
For us,
I mean, if we are going to look from the theological perspective, what is the theology? What is the Christian theology all about? It is to understand the other, and to accept the other, and to respect the other. I mean, Christ came to the world for the other. We're not going to preach now, but that's the whole essence of Christian theology. And nowadays, what we are going through, especially in our part of the world, is the rejection of the other. So we definitely need the Christian theology in this part of the world. Not necessarily for proselytism, don't misunderstand me, but to create a platform, to create a basis where people can accept one another.
We can't expect Christianity to make inroads into the Eastern Mediterranean in view of the circumstances.
Of course.
But we can try to bring liberal democracy into the Eastern Mediterranean. Liberal democracy is, in a sense, an offshoot of the Greco-Christian tradition.
Yes.
But it's not tainted with religion as such. And indeed, there's a secular foundation to a good deal of liberal democracy. So I would suggest that a way we can try and counteract the religious extremism and the misuse of religion is to do our best in the Eastern Mediterranean, at least, first of all, to shore up liberal democracy and liberal democratic values, and secondly, to try, insofar as we can, to spread the values and the principles of liberal democracy into this region.
And
without allowing the exceptions, though, that have become the rationalization is, well, democracy, you have to contextualize it.
Well,
and in the context of the Middle East, it has to be X, Y, and Z. And X, Y, and Z makes it illiberal.
Well,
but it's okay because it's in the context. You know, we've completed a circle that we've canceled ourselves. Well, I agree with you absolutely that that's the way to go. But the rationalization of the exception is such
this is why
that we're nullifying the whole argument.
Well, this is I've got to mention Cyprus here. A bicommunal
Cyprus is exactly the point.
A bicommunal federation means the citizens split into two. A bizonal federation means the territory of a state split into two. How is it going to be split into two? It's going to be split into two on essentially religious as well as ethnic lines. That's contrary to the basic principles
even more
of
basic,
democracy.
it's a violation of fundamental rights. And you know, if you're going to be, you know, insist on liberal democracy, you have to insist on its underlying principles. Now, is there a hope for that in the Middle East? Or are we always going to excuse ourselves and excuse the violators by saying, well, you got to be in context?
We as Christians, we are people of hope. We don't look to the glass which is half empty and we say it's half empty or half full. We look to the glass and we say that we want to see that the glass is completely full. That's the kind of a person we as Christians are, or our Christian theology, that is what it is, or we should be. So, I mean, I personally believe that the day will come when this will stop by one way or the other. It will stop, and the time will come to rebuild this region. And in this rebuilding process, what you mentioned here is equally important. But I feel that theology is also an equal part in order to bring these values. And this is where I see the importance of the Christian presence and the Christian church and Christian theology in rebuilding this region. And this is why I always emphasize that the Christian community should stay here. And maybe more than any other time, Christian theology now is needed in this time of crisis. Because people have so many questions.
Is there any infrastructure support, and I mean infrastructure, organizational support for these people to stay? Now the organizational support is focused on enabling the refugees to leave, no matter what they are. You know, is there a chance of turning that around, making... But what sort of support can you give them in an alien environment where their lives are...
The lives are in danger, and especially people are fearful. When fear enters into your heart, you know it, as a human being. I mean, you
know, let me just give you a historical allusion. In the, you know, the 20th, 19th century, the great powers each had a protected community, a Christian community. And therefore, some of the powers that be in the region were afraid of consequences, of real consequences. So they didn't attack the Orthodox because the Tsar would be pissed off, or the British or the French, etc. I mean, I don't see that happening again. In fact, it may bring the opposite effect. But can you see some sort of a guarantee by the UN or the civilized powers or something? I mean, that will affect a change in this thinking? Because I don't think just waiting for them these guys to get mellow and change their mind, I don't think it's going to happen.
No,
they
no.
react to some sort of, you know, potential price that they will have to pay.
So far, there is no gurantor as such.
There's nothing.
There is no guarantor.
Nobody.
I agree with you. There is no guarantor as such.
Europe, the EU, okay, what? It's facilitating what's happening.
Yep.
There's no will to fight it on a philosophical level, I think.
And I'm not sure if this, maybe we shouldn't enter into a completely new field, but I'm not sure if the secular ideology, or whatever you want to call it, that Europe has embraced, especially some parts of Europe, which is very much becoming secular, and I'm not sure to what extent this is also helping to the greater Middle East region, and especially for the Christian presence.
Yeah.
If the Christian presence in Europe had been relatively stronger, most likely
the reaction would have been different.
The reaction would have been different.
Yeah.
Can I just I'll make my last contribution, and I wanted to read to you something that the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Lord Sachs, said in the British Parliament, because he's a member of the British Parliament, on the 16th of July 2015. And I think this is really a good way of sort of tying the various threads of our discussion together. He said the following: 3 things have happened to change the religious landscape of the world in recent years. First, the secular nationalist regimes that appeared in many parts of the world in the 20th century have given rise to powerful religious counter-revolutions.
Yep.
Secondly, these counter-revolutions are led by religion in its most extreme, adversarial and anti-Western form. Thirdly, the revolution in information technology has allowed these groups to form, organize and communicate to actual and potential followers throughout the world with astonishing speed. The result has been the politicization of religion and the religionizing of politics, which throughout history has been a deadly combination. In the long run, it will threaten us all, because in a global age, no country or culture is an island.
Yeah.
And he concluded,
Yep.
I'll just finish this, we must stand together, the people of all faiths and of none,
Exactly.
for we are all at risk. Religious freedom is about our common humanity,
Yep.
and we must fight for it if we are not to lose it. This, I believe, is the issue of our time.
Just in a nutshell, can we appeal to the common humane heart of these two religions in this part of the world?
It's the three religions.
The
Don't
three
forget,
religions.
monotheistic religions. It's the Christianity, Islam, and then the Judaism, right?
But it's the Judeo-Christian tradition,
Yeah, I
religion,
mean, so-
and Islam. Is there a common human heart, humane heart?
There should be. There should be.
Can we reach it?
Well, this is what exactly I think the rabbi had. He has summarized so well. I mean, these 3 points. I mean, the way. I mean, and this secular
Inshallah, as I
society.
say.
Well, not only inshallah, but I think we need to do more than inshallah, and this is what exactly we're trying to do. And as Christians, that's our theology. It's theology of creating this platform where the three monotheistic religions to come together and to live.
Okay.
And I mean.
So
I was born in Middle East. Let me make it. I was born in Middle East. I was raised in Middle East, and I still today cherish with the values of Middle East. Middle East is such a beautiful place, you know, and one of its beauties is the coming together of the different cultures, of the different ethnic groups, of the different religions together.
Sure.
We want to finish on a positive note here. Our concern is to establish the Eastern Mediterranean as a vibrant, ethical, and successful part of the world. That's the spirit of ERPIC. It's the spirit of the people who participate in these discussions. And I think you've put your finger on one of the keys to achieving that noble but difficult objective, and that is to embrace the diversity of this part of the world, to try and rebuild what has been destroyed, and to try and build a future that is based on what you said earlier and what the Chief Rabbi said, our common humanity.
Yes.
Yes.
That's the key to the success of this part.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.